in order to achieve the goal we have set ourselves to disarm Iraq.
In his interview, the French president mentioned this evening no fewer than 4 times to stress he didn't think war was justified as of that moment. But Mr. Blair seized on only the first half of President Chirac's statement.
If France or any other country is simply going to say we will veto no matter what, well, that's obviously a very difficult position.
In fact, President Chirac had not said no matter what, as if forever. He had stressed that if the Iraqis ceased to cooperate with the weapons inspectors, war would become inevitable. It just wasn't today. But in Number 10's briefing to the press, neither they nor Mr. Blair mentioned this important qualification. Watching these extraordinary events from close quarters in Number 10 was Sir Stephen Wall, the Prime Minister's European Affairs advisor.
Do you think Downing Street willfully misconstrued what the French president had said?
I think that they, I wouldn't say willfully misconstrued in this sense, that I think that Tony Blair and other members of the government were convinced that there was no circumstance in which France was prepared to support action.
Ever?
Ever. But if you mean, did they take Chirac's words and take them out of the total context in which they were made? Undoubtedly.
The Sun newspaper had already run banner headlines softening up President Chirac.
Squirm, worm. Wriggly wobbler Chirac. Stop squirming.
Now the Sun accused the French president of being
a cheap tart who puts price before principle.
We've been told that in Number 10, the Prime Minister and Alastair Campbell expressed approval of the Sun's coverage.
Jacques Chirac struts the streets of shame. Like all who ply the trade of the harlot, they will catch something very nasty.
Do you think actually that Downing Street quite deliberately were playing the French card?
I mean, there's no doubt that the French card was deliberately played. I mean,
blame it on the French.
Yeah, I mean, you know, death to the French is always a pretty good cry in British politics. When you're in a tight corner, knocking the French is not a bad policy, and this was a tight corner. I mean, here was a government that was fighting for its life.
Ministerial resignations were threatened, the country and MPs divided. The French embassy complained to the Foreign Office that Number 10 had deployed Soviet-style disinformation. We understand the Foreign Office's political director responded, "What your president said was such a gift." But it was not the French who finally killed off Mr. Blair's hopes of winning a second resolution.
The British were asking the Americans, give us a little more time. It was not France, it was the United States who did not want to give us more time. It did not want to give Saddam Hussein, the United Nations, or the Security Council, or the British for that matter, more time.
I know this. I was just given the order last week to get another 15 ships underway, and they're loading Marines. Go figure.
With the American forces ready to go, Mr. Blair's commitment to President Bush had brought him to a legal crossroads. Foreign Office lawyers still believed that war without the explicit authority of the Security Council voting for a second resolution would be illegal. But help was at hand. This is Lord Goldsmith. As Attorney General, he's the government's most senior legal advisor. He's also been described as a loyal Labour Party foot soldier. Lord Goldsmith was certainly leaving it late to come to a settled view about such a critical issue as whether war with Iraq would be legal.
On the 11th of February, the Attorney General travelled here to Washington to hear from US government lawyers why they thought going to war without a second resolution was lawful. We've been told by sources in a position to know that until this point, Lord Goldsmith was by no means convinced it would be lawful. But after spending a day in Washington, he is said to have left with his spine stiffened, at least a little.
2 weeks later, the Attorney General met with the Prime Minister's inner policy circle at number 10. A week after that, he delivered his written advice to the Prime Minister. The advice ran to 13 pages.
Minute to the Prime Minister, dated Friday the 7th of March 2003.
We've been told that Lord Goldsmith advised it would be preferable to have a second resolution, but that he could make a case for going to war without one.
I have considered the relevant...
On the other hand, there were risks.
The risks indicated in particular the possibility of legal proceedings against the United Kingdom. My understanding again is that the United Kingdom took steps to protect itself against such proceedings, for example by beginning the task of preparing legal advisers to assist in the defence of a case. So it was a very equivocal advice. It was a balanced advice.
The Chief of Defence Staff was not happy with this balanced advice. Admiral Boyce needed to be sure his troops were not at risk of fighting an illegal war. The Admiral required a crystal clear answer from the Attorney General.
The Chief of Defence Staff was concerned about having a very clear-cut tick in the box that this war was going to be legal. I heard that what he saw then, what the service chief saw then, was not the clear-cut tick in the box they're looking for.
A quarter of the British Army was now battle-ready on the Arabian Peninsula.
There are, I think, 2 or 3 ships yet to come in. I would have thought 4 or 5 days would pretty much complete the whole logistic piece. But even if it were today, it's good to go.
Fortunately for the Prime Minister, the Attorney General's view had continued its evolution to the point of complete clarity. All the caveats had now been stripped out of it. On the 13th of March, Lord Goldsmith informed Number 10 it was his clear view that Britain could go to war without a second resolution. So what had changed over the previous month to stiffen his spine still further?
Nobody can avoid the obvious fact that the view changed when we found that we couldn't get the second resolution. And I am rather disturbed that there were discussions with the Attorney General in Downing Street. What is important is that the Attorney General should be semi-detached, should provide an independent legal view, should not himself become drawn in to the debates and negotiations within government as to what the appropriate course of action is. And I think on this occasion the Chinese walls got broken down in a way that's damaging to the authority of the post and needs to be rebuilt.
The Attorney General has told us he doesn't wish to discuss how he came to his view that the war was legal, other than to say it was his own view, genuine and independent. However, what has astonished so many senior civil servants is that the Cabinet only had the assurance from the Attorney General that war would be legal just 3 days before the bombing started.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Right. Can I ask the Attorney General to set out the legal position on the use of force? Sir.
Authority to use force against Iraq exists from the combined effect of Resolutions 678, 687 and 1441. All of these resolutions were adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which allows...
You can all read.
The International Development Secretary Claire Short tried to start a discussion about why the Attorney General's opinion was so late and whether he had any doubts about the legality of Britain going to war.
To read it out loud.
Peter, I understand.
But she says the Cabinet was impatient, and they were happy to let Lord Goldsmith stick to his prepared text, which was just 1 page, not the earlier 13 pages of advice with caveats and qualifications he'd sent to the Prime Minister. So the cabinet was never told Mr. Blair risked being brought before an international tribunal. To this day, Number 10 refuses to disclose the Attorney General's earlier legal advice about the risks of going to war without a second resolution.
We stretched the legal argument to breaking point, in my view, and the fact that we didn't have that authority, I think, does set a dangerous precedent. I regret that I didn't speak my mind to Tony Blair on it. I think that at the end of the day, going to war is about the most serious thing you can do in international. It is the most serious thing you can do in international affairs. And if you're going to put people's lives at risk, or own people, apart from the civilians in the country where you're attacking, it does have to be the last resort, and you do actually need some international authority to do it.
For standing by George Bush, Tony Blair, Prime Minister of Great Britain, is in the fight of his life.
Let's talk about the president's strongest ally in one, Prime Minister Tony Blair. He's asking British lawmakers to support a war against Iraq. A vote expected in the next few hours. Blair says that the Iraq crisis will determine the shape of international politics.
The Prime Minister had promised the fullest possible debate in Parliament.
Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the motion standing on the order paper in my name and those of my...
Mr. Blair told MPs that but for France's threat to veto the second resolution, Britain might have won a majority in the Security Council for invasion.
Last Monday, we were getting very close with it. We very nearly had the majority agreement.
But according to some of the diplomats involved in the actual negotiations, this was not true.
The statement from Mr. Blair, and it's one of several in this vein, quotes, "We very nearly had a majority agreement." That doesn't...
No, we were never close to have a majority agreement, never.
We very nearly achieved agreement, he says. What about that one?
We were never close to that. Not the agreement that would have satisfied the Americans.
And what indeed, Mr. Speaker?
The Prime Minister insisted that in going to war, Britain would be upholding the authority of the UN to ensure that Iraq complied with UN disarmament resolutions.
Capacity, I'm afraid, to pass firm resolutions.
I think that's an absurdity, that here a minority of the Council goes to war to uphold the authority of a majority that is against it.
We are asked now, seriously, to accept that in the last few years, contrary to all history, contrary to all intelligence, he decided unilaterally to destroy these weapons. I say such a claim is palpably absurd.
Yeah. Was it palpably absurd?
No, it was not. And the inspectors had not really asserted that these things existed. They had calculated material balances, and they said here are lots of things unaccounted for. And it wasn't absurd that they had destroyed it.
The moment of truth for Mr. Blair. MPs are now...
The Prime Minister won a large majority, but the country at large was still split right down the middle, as 2 years ago tonight he took Britain to war.
So our choice is clear. Back down and leave Saddam hugely strengthened, or proceed to disarm him by force. Retreat might give us a moment of respite, but years of repentance at our weakness would, I believe, follow.
The search for weapons of mass destruction has been abandoned. No WMD has been found. About half of MI6's main sources that were used to build up the Iraq dossier have been withdrawn as unreliable. Number 10 has told Panorama the Prime Minister has nothing to add to the facts and findings of the 4 inquiries that have already been held. But there is one issue that none of these inquiries has focused on.